Hello everyone, welcome to Mahamana Academy. Today we are going to start world politics and the first chapter is Cold War. Okay? So, before studying about the Cold War, let's just see, the phase when the Cold War started and why it started, right? So, we have already discussed this in the chapter of when we are discussing the contents, but let me just revise it again. So basically what happened is that there was a two world war, right? From 1914 to 18 and then from 39 to 45. Let me just write it here. So World War First. (1939 to 1945). So what is important for us is the Second World War, because after the Second World War, the Cold War started. And why it was Cold War? Because the World War was so intense, it was so violent, and it has led the financial loss to the countries that now they are not resorting to have that war which affect the countries, right, in financial terms, in killing terms, right? So that's why they keep the things cold, right? The Cold War is that they have the capacity to fight, but because they have their experiences from the past, so that's why they are not ready or they are not willing to have that losses again, right? So what happened in Second World War, that there was two alliance, right? So there was the Axis power and the Allied forces, right? So in the Axis power we had Japan, Germany and Italy, right? And the Allied forces, France, UK, or you can say Britain, and then the two important countries that emerged during that time, because before, if you see the US, so here let's just see the US and USSR. Okay, so when we are talking about the US before World War II or during that Cold War, US has used the policy of isolationism. It means that in spite having that capabilities, the US never intervened in what happening in world politics, right? But in World War II, right, World War II, the US get involved. Why it get involved? Because Japan has attacked the US, and in that response, the US has attacked the Japan, and that is, we all know about it, the Japan Hiroshima and Nagasaki attack, right? So that was that culmination point where the World War II ended, right? But now we can see the consequences. We can see how at this point also Japan is suffering from that attack, right? We know the financial losses the countries had suffered, right? So that's why when World War II ended, so France and UK, they were already European countries and they were very big countries before World War. So they just tried to maintain their financial condition first, right? So in this way, Allied forces defeated them, and then the France and UK were not that much interested. So now we have these two countries, US and USSR, and this is how they are emerging. These two countries become powerful after the World War II. And the Cold War is a rivalry between these two countries, right? US and USSR. Let me just take the another color so it will be clear. So we have here US and USSR, and this what we are going to study in this chapter, right? So what we are going to study in this chapter is a Cold War, right? And then the non-aligned movement. So when there was a rivalry between US and USSR, right? So there was also an alliance system. Alliance system in the sense that the most of the countries in the Eastern and the Western European countries, they joined either the US or the USSR, right? So in that alliance system, there was one movement, right, which has not joined any of the alliances, and that was NAM. And NAM is very important from our perspective, is because Nehru at that time was the founder member of NAM, non-aligned movement. Okay, and then we will talk about the NIEO. It's a economic formation. It is also a part of non-aligned movement. How after having a cooperation on a political ground, they also initiated that cooperation on the economic ground, right? So that we are going to discuss in this chapter. So what is Cold War? Let me just tell you that World War. What was World War? World War was a kind of intense rivalry. Killings happened. They have used the weapons, nuclear weapons, right? So they were very much aware that there is a consequences of using these weapons, the killings of innocents, right? And also the if you see from the from top level, you can see the financial losses, right? So the US and USSR emerged as a superpower at that point after World War II, but they were very much aware that there is a consequences if they will come in a direct rivalry, right? So that's why they keep their rivalry very soft, very cold. So that's why they had their contestations, they had their differences, but they have not resorted to go to the war, right? So that's why it's a Cold War, and that's why we called it Cold War, right? So basically, what is Cold War? It is a competition, tensions or confrontation, as I told you, between the US and USSR, right? US and USSR, backed by their allies. As I mentioned, the alliance system, right? So allies is like all these countries which were somehow supporting either USA or other USSR, right? So it is basically this is a very fact-based question. If maybe they can ask in MCQs, otherwise you just have to just see and look that who has coined the term Cold War. Coined the term is who has given that word, right? So that word is given by the Bernard Baruch, right? So, when we are talking about the Cold War is one thing we have to remember in a Cold War, that Cold War is an ideological war also, right? So let me just clarify this. How? Let's just see this USA, okay? And here we have USSR, right? So USA we know is a democratic country. It's a liberal democratic country, right? So it's a liberal democratic country, right? And in case of USSR, it's a communist system. So what is communist system? Communist system is, you can say, that the extreme form of socialism, and there is also communist party. If you notice in Russia, there is a communist party, right? So that's why their political structure is, so the communism or the liberal democratic, it's a political structure, right? So the communism is a political structure of USSR, and liberal democratic structure is a political structure of USA, right? And because their political structure is different, right? Although during the World War II, they came together and they fought against the Axis forces, but now they have this rivalry is because of their political structure, their ideologies are also different, right? So because it's a liberal democratic, so their ideology is liberal, right? And their ideology is socialist. Okay. So when we are talking about the liberal structure means there is a freedom, right? Liberal means freedom, rule of law, right? Competition. If we relate it to the economic structure, it's a competition, right? So this is the liberal structure. But when we are discussing the socialist system, it's a collectivization, right? Collectivization means that everything is in the control of top leaders, right? They are, there is no competition first of all, and they are taking all the resources in their hand, the top leaders, and then they are allocating the resources to the people in form of subsidies, in form of health infrastructure, and kind of, right? So there is no competition, and everything is get managed by the state, right? So here you can see that difference in ideological and political structure, and also the economic structure, because the economy also run by that, right? So that's why there was also that ideological conflict, right? So when we are saying the Cold War, first of all, you have to remember and you have to be very clear, because Cold War is a very basic of your world politics, right? Because here we are starting our syllabus. So it's what is it? It's a rivalry, right, between US and USSR, and it is also an ideological conflict, right? And it's not a full-fledged war. It's a very indirect confrontation. Right. So we have already discussed the background in the first slide. We have already discussed. Let me just highlight which is important one, and then we will go forward. So we have discussed World War II during the 1939 and 45, and then there was Allied forces, Axis power. Right. Allied forces defeated Axis power. In this way, the World War II ended, and then we have discussed the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bomb dropping by the USA, right? And then we have seen the victory of Allied forces. So it was the background, and then the Cold War started. US, and here the US and USSR is emerging, right? Then next slide, here, Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So when we are discussing about the Cuban Missile Crisis, let's just first go and see the background first, right? Because as I mentioned, the communism, about the containment policy of USSR, there is also a background which is related to the Cuban Missile Crisis, to that policy, right? And that we are going to discuss here, right? So let's just see what is Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis is what? It is just a area, right, where the rivalry happened. So Cuba, what is a Cuba? Cuba is a place, is a region where the rivalry happened between the US and the USSR. So basically, why this rivalry happened? So let me just take you to the background. So what happened is, there was in the Cuba, there was the person called the Fidel Castro, right? And he was very staunch follower or very strict follower of communism, right? So he was the follower of communism, right? So because he was the he was the follower of communism, and communism is a kind of very strict policy where there is no freedom, there is no competition. So some people, right, so some people have exiled from the Cuba, right? And what USA did, USA, while pursuing its containment of communism policy, USA helped those exiled people, and they, by the support of USA, they have attacked in that region, and that region, because it was somewhere near the river, so that called the Bay of Pigs, right? And basically they ask question in MCQs, and that's why I'm discussing here Bay of Pigs. So basically the exiled people, with the support of US, they have attacked here, but it was failed attempt. Okay, so it was a failed attempt, right? But that became the very foundation of that rivalry that happened in Cuba, right? So in that way, what happened? Now US attacked, US not attacked directly, but with supported those people, right? In the response, what happened is USSR made their base there, the military base in the Cuba, right? And when the USSR made the military base there, so in that way, in response to that military base, the US warned the USSR, and you can see here in the Cuba that how there was a chances that the Cold War can become hot war or can become a normal war, right? So that's why Cuban Missile Crisis is a very important context when we are discussing when we are discussing Cold War, that how there was a intense competition, intense rivalry already happening, but because there was some understanding, or there was some the learning from their past, that they have not resorted to that war, and with the warning. Okay, so because of that warning, that given by the USA, the USSR backed away. Okay, so in that way, this is the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So let's just see. If we see the sentence wise, first one, you can see that it's a place where they have installed the missile. So USSR has installed the missile. Why they have installed? We already know that Bay of Pigs incidents, right? And then what happened is, so you can see how the president Fidel Castro, right? He was the president at that time, and he was supporter of communism. And then the US president. Okay, so why I'm highlighting this? Nikita Khrushchev, Kennedy, Fidel Castro, these are very important because Cuban Missile Crisis itself important because in Cold War. So Fidel Castro was president that time, Kennedy was US president, and Nikita Khrushchev was general secretariat from the USSR, right? So these are important from your MCQ's point of view. And then you can see how, the Khrushchev, or you can see the USSR has removed their missiles, and that has somehow not developed or not had gradually turned into hot war or a normal war, right? So it was the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So coming to the Cold War, we have discussed the rivalry between the US and USSR, okay, and then we have discussed these power, right? The Allied forces and the Axis power. And then we have also discussed the attack by the US on the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? So now we have on the global stage only two countries, US and USSR, right? And and you can see how, in spite of intense rivalry, that rivalry you have already seen how in the Cuba what happened, right? There was a logic of deterrence. There is one space left here, so logic of deterrence. And in this slide, this term is very important. So what is logic of deterrence? Logic of deterrence is what I was saying, that to avoid war, right? To not resort, to somehow avoiding that full-fledged war, right? So logic of deterrence was their logic of not going to that war and to feel that consequences again, right? So logic of deterrence is their way of dealing with that rivalry, right? And because of that, somehow that rivalry not turned into normal war, right? And that remained Cold War. So here the important term here you can see is a logic of deterrence, right? Because one thing that you can see here, they cannot afford to initiate war. Here, not afford to initiate war is not about the economic structure, right? They have the economic infrastructure, they have the power, they have the military equipments, but why they can't afford? Because they don't want to feel that consequences again, what they have seen in the World War II, right? So that's why they can't afford that war. And that rationale which have had there in the mind of US and USSR, that rationale was logic of deterrence. Okay, so now you can see I have somehow made a difference with this chart so that you can easily see, if you can see Western Europe, here I am writing the USA and here the USSR, right? So here the Western allies, if you see the Europe here, this is the Eastern Europe and this is the Western Europe, right? So this Western Europe is kind of part of USA, right? Most of the countries are part of USA, and here the eastern part of Europe, they are the part of USSR. So that's why here the Eastern Alliance and the Western Alliance. So it is basically, it is denoting the Eastern European countries and the Western European countries, right? And then they had very important military pact. So what is military pact? Military pact is basically when they are, you know, there is alliance, when they are making that alliance. This alliance is for the political purposes, but this alliance is basically for the military purposes. If someone is attacking one country, that means they are attacking everyone, and they have to retaliate. So in that way, they have formed their military alliances. So in the USA, you can see the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is still in the existence, right? At this point in 2024 also, it is in the existence, and it is somehow, we will discuss how in the Russia-Ukraine war also, the NATO was the reason why this, you know, war has happened, because somehow Ukraine wanted to join NATO, right? And the Russia was opposing it. So that became the reason, and that's another debate. But let's just focus here, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was the military organization of USA. And in the response, the military organization of USSR was Warsaw Pact, right? And also that they formed in 1955. Here they have formed that in April 1949. So, you know, NATO, when it was formed, April 1949, Warsaw Pact, when it was formed, 1955. So these are very important from your MCQ point of view, right? And then they have some other treaty organizations, which is SEATO and CENTO, right? And then the Soviet Union, they had a connection with communist China, North Korea. So, you know, one thing you should, it will help to remember you who are the countries which are, you know, in the support of, which are supporting the USSR. So let's just see the North Vietnam, North Korea and Iraq. So somehow these countries are also are the followers of communism, you can see, right? Communist China also, at this point in the present time, their economic structure, we will discuss in 5th chapter, their economic structure is capitalism, but their political structure is communism. North Vietnam, they are also, and North Korea, you can see how they are, you know, at this point they are making military equipment. So these are also, so, you know, Iraq, North Vietnam, North Korea, these are the part of communism. And then here you can see the SEATO, okay, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. Try to remember the names also, right? Central Treaty Organization, right? So maybe they can ask the abbreviation kind of question. So try to remember this, okay? And then you can see that there was the division, and we have already discussed here. And to have that clarity, you can see the map, right? So these are the NATO members. So this map is basically showing the military alliances, right? So this yellow portion is NATO members, right? And then the Warsaw or the USSR military pact is red one, and then you can see this green line. These are the communist nations, right? So you can see this map so that you can relate and learn this differences, and this differences is very important. You have to learn this, and you have to read it again and again, right? So now we are gradually moving towards the non-aligned movement, right? So we have discussed the rivalry, right? But there is also a question, is there any a way out? So yeah, there was a way out that was initiated by the 4 people, right? And one founder member was Nehru, right? So, you know, during that time, World War II, 1939 to 1945, right? India got independence in 1947, right? And likewise of India, many other countries also getting independence from their colonies, because the major power was getting involved in World War, right? So there was also a kind of newly independent countries which were emerging, right? So what was option for them? 3 options there was. Like earlier there was 2 options, either to join the US or the USSR, but this NAM has created the 3rd option. not to join either bloc. But that does not mean that it is an isolation and not to involve. It is a kind of get involved in that, but not supporting any of the alliances. Right. So that was the NAM. Right. So it was like one way you can see. And also when we were discussing about the communist China, so we have discussed that communist China was part of USSR. But one thing also happened in 1969, right? So they had a brief kind of rivalry happened. So this is also important in this slide. 1969 event, what happened is there was a rivalry between USSR and China, right? So there was a rivalry between them in 1969. And now you can relate how, you know, they have resorted to the economic structure which is liberal one. Why? Because you can see how 1969 the rivalry happened, and in 1972, right, Deng Xiaoping and some other leaders of China, they came closer to the USA, and then they adopted the economic structure which is based on competition, right? So they have adopted basically the economic structure in liberal form. Right, so that rivalry is important, 1969 rivalry. And why that rivalry happened? It was because there was a kind of tug of war, that they are not getting that much importance that they need. Right, so that was the reason. Okay, and this chart is also very important. So when we will discuss, because it's a first chapter, right? So the basic thing should be very clear, right? So this chart is very important from why? Because here we are discussing three options, right? I was discussing. So the first option is USA, second is USSR, and then the third, all those newly independent countries, right? So, and that's why the first world, second world, and the third world. Even in at that point, when there is a where the USSR disintegrated, okay, so when USSR disintegration after 1990s also, we sometime instead of saying this country is a post-colonialist country, we sometimes call it third world countries. Okay, so don't get confused with that. It's a term that was given during the Cold War, right? Because there was three world. One was the US alliance, and then the USSR alliances, and the newly independent countries. That was that they got independence. There was during the World War II or after that, right? So that's why, and these these third world countries are basically very poor economically, if we say, because they were somehow the colonies of some powerful countries, right? So that's why we also sometimes relate third world with with poverty, with lack of infrastructure, with lack of capacity. But we will discuss in fourth or fifth chapter probably that how from these countries, from third world also, in terms of economy, the Southeast Asian countries are also emerging, India is emerging, and the other countries are also emerging. But at that point during the Cold War, you can see that their structure, their economic structure, their political structure were very pathetic at that point, right? So what is the alliances? Okay, so when we are talking about the alliances, we have already discussed that they have somehow, there is two, let's just suppose and imagine in your mind that if there is a class, okay, and only two, there is a class of 100 people, right? And only two people, two monitors are there. Suppose, for example, here we are considering those monitors are the US or the USSR, right? So what will happen? So it's a basic tendency of people to to be friended with those people. So if USA is powerful, so it's a basic tendency that you will join either US or USSR, because you want you want something in terms of economic structure, in terms of infrastructure, right? You need some help or aid from that superpower, right? Likewise in class, why you get befriended with brilliant students, with monitors, because you want to learn something, right? So in same way, this alliances, that those countries from the Eastern or European countries, they were joining the US and USSR because they wanted to have the good infrastructure resource. And in the next, so here you can see that the purpose is, what was their purpose? They wanted the resources, right? So basically, you know, if you see the, you have seen that they wanted the infrastructure development, right? But seeing from the USSR or the US perspective, now one thing is, you are joining the monitors, you are befriending with, but why the monitors are, you know, interested in getting befriended with you? It's because they also have their interest with you, right? So if there is no interest, there is no friendship, right? So the small countries, they want the infrastructure development, they want that protection also. If someone will attack those countries, so US or USSR will help them, right? But in the same way, why US or USSR were interested in those countries? Because they were getting the resources, right? The new countries, they had the resources. In the Middle East countries, you can see there was a vast resources of oil refineries, right? So that was their interest. And then the territory, location, and the economic support. So there was many reason, right, why these alliances happened. So it was interest from both the side, from the small countries and also from the superpowers, so that and because of that they come together, right? And one also important interest of US and USSR is that because there was rivalry, right? There was rivalry between US and USSR, so they wanted to show that they are more powerful. So the more country will join them, this depicts that more powerful they are, right? So in that way also, they were attracting many countries, and US has properly, you know, they had their policy. We have already discussed the containment of communism, right? So that was a part of how attracting the alliances to their sides. And then, okay, so likewise, we have discussed the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was one example where the, you know, what become the arena. We don't call, when we are discussing the Cold War, we don't call it area or the region, we call it arena, right? So one arena was Cuba, and the other you can see is a Korea, you know, where a kind of hostilities or rivalry happened between the US and USSR. Right. So that was Afghanistan, Vietnam, and Korea. Right. So from MCQ point of view, these are very important. When this happened, Korea from 50 to 53. Berlin is a Germany. Right. So we have, you know, one thing we can also discuss here is that, you know, when Cold War started, there was one wall called the Berlin Wall. That was also formed during the 1948, right? We have, you know, discussed how there was a world map, and there was a two country, this side the USSR and this side the US and the third world countries. So that war somehow, you know, divided those German people between the US and the USSR. One side you can see the USA is making their policies of containment of China, communism. So the USSR also made this kind of plan, and they have formed the Berlin Wall so that the people cannot go to the Western Bloc, right? So that that wall also signify the rivalry of Cold War during that time, right? But that wall, in second chapter we will discuss how that wall was also fall down after the disintegration of USSR that happened in 1990s, right? So this we will discuss in second chapter, but it's just for your understanding that we have discussed here, right? And then we have Congo. So these are some arenas, you know, where the things happened. So the shooting war is kind of where they have somehow used the military weapon, but in a very, you know, in a very meager or very limited way, right? So these were the arenas where the kind of rivalry can be seen. And in Afghanistan, you know what happened in Afghanistan? It's another story, that there was a period of dead day right? We have discussed the logic of deterrence. So that logic of deterrence was somehow was during that time, but then USSR suddenly attacked in 1979, and then again that rivalry got intense. So in all those arenas, you can see that how they were, getting involved and having their rivalries. So you cannot just deny and you can say that there was no rivalry. There was rivalry, but why they can't afford? Because they know the consequences and they don't want to get involved because they don't want to see that economic and political consequences. Okay, that's why they couldn't afford that. And here it's just a cartoon from your book. You can how see the USSR and USA, and then the China, right? So you can see how the China was a part of communism, and what happened in 1969, and how it's a very funny thing, and it's just for your understanding that they have given you this cartoon that during US and USSR they had their alliances, 1969 communist countries, but you can see that how he is holding the hand of USA. So it somehow signifies that how they have opted for the economic structure which is liberal. Instead of having that communist political structure, China has opted the liberal economic structure. So that is a cartoon. It's not just it's just for our understanding. It's not that important. Now coming to the role of Nehru and the NAM, we have discussed the rivalry, and now what options left for the third world countries is that this NAM, right? So NAM is basically, we have discussed that it is a kind of system to get to restrain from joining any of the alliances, right? So you can see that there was a military build-ups, right, between the superpowers, that military alignment, right? And outside that bloc, there was a non-alignment countries. So we will discuss the non-aligned countries, but here we will discuss the important points which I think is important to for you to understand. So the first one is what is nuclear weapon, non-nuclear weapons, right? So nuclear weapon is where you are using the biological or chemical weapons, right? And it's a very intense, so that is nuclear weapon. Non-nuclear weapon is a kind of also using the bullets and all, right? And then we have here the important thing is arms control. So there is two policy. First one is deterrence, to not to go to the war, right? And the second thing to avoid war is arms control. Because somehow if you are going to have that war, it means that you have a nuclear weapon, and by controlling that nuclear weapon, you somehow can control the war, right? So that arms control, right? So why arms control important? So because we have to learn some of the arms control treaties as well, right? That treaties happened between, so it's a kind of mutual agreement, right? So it's a kind of mutual agreement between the US and USSR to try to control the arm or to limit the arms so that the rivalry could not happen to that way, right? So in that way, you can see some of the important one, like Limited Test Ban Treaty, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile, Arms Limitation Talk, and so on, right? So in the upcoming slides, we will discuss about it. Let's just be there that we had two rivalry. We have two countries having their rivalry. NAM is emerging in between, and then in order to restrain from the war, they have some arms control treaty, and that treaties are these. Okay, so these are very important. These treaties are very important because these are the arms control treaty. And one thing I just have, although it's a fact-based question, right? So let's just for understanding, I'm just discussing this for understanding. So the first one we have here is, dates are very important, right? So 5 August 1963, it was somehow signed, right? So it was signed on 5 August 1963, but entered into force on 10 October 1963. And it somehow confused you, right? So you will just remember, okay, 1963. But what kind of questions they can ask is that when the limited LTBT LTBT was signed. So when they are asking when it was signed, 5 August 1963. When they are asking when entered into force, then the 10 August 1963. In the same way, you have to see in the other also, entered into force in 1970 and signed in 1st July 1968, and it was extended for in 1995, right? Extended means that it is still in existence, right? And then you can see, okay, so SALT, I'm just, Strategic Arm Limitation Treaty and Strategic Arm Reduction Treaty, right? So here you can see one thing that Afghanistan attack in 1979. Try to relate things, right? So SALT happened, the first round of SALT happened in 1969, entered into force in 1972, and then the second one is 72, right? But you can see how after this the attack happened on Afghanistan, right? And then the things got again got intense. The rivalry also again get started, and then only after 1990s you can see in 1991 that again this armed limitation treaty happened between the US and USSR. There are many treaties, arms control treaties and non-proliferation treaties kind of, that happened among the countries. But here we are discussing only those treaties which is between US and USSR, right? So there is n number of treaties which, if you will get somewhere information, or if they will ask MCQs, I will also share with you if you want. But here, because your syllabus is about the Cold War, so we are discussing only the treaties that happened between the US and USSR, right? And then the START happened. So one thing which is important in all the treaties is that try to remember when it was signed, when it came into force, who was the president from US side and who was the general secretary from the USSR side. Okay, so in all treaties, what you have to remember: when it was signed, when it was entered into force. It's just for your understanding, so that you can remember well, right? And then US president, who was the US president at that time? So here you can see that here the US president is US Richard Nixon, right? And then who is the general secretary of USSR, right? So that Brezhnev, right? So in that way you have to remember these things. And one thing you can add on here also is that SALT 1 happened in 1991, SALT 2 happened in 1993, and now the SALT 2nd and SALT 3 has also happened in the current time, right? So that you can also see if they can ask in MCQ. Otherwise, it's enough. You can just see and remember these treaties, right? So, challenge to the bipolarity. What is bipolarity? Bi means two. Okay, so bipolarity means US and USSR, two superpower. That means bipolarity. So what happened is there is three kind of system. Either it's a unipolar world, bipolar, or the multipolar world. So I will just give you a quick example. Bipolar world during the Cold War, because there was two countries, right? US and USSR. But what happened after USSR in disintegration? The USA become the sole superpower. So that system become the unipolar world, right? And then the multipolar world, here we can see at the current time that there is China rising also, India is also major power, and some Southeast Asian countries, they are also emerging as the Asian tigers. So there are multiple, power you can see. So that is a multipolar world, right? So in that context, they have used the challenge to bipolarity, means the challenge to the US and USSR, right? And that challenge was by the non-aligned movement, because they have given the third option to those all independent countries, right? Newly independent countries. So, these founding figures are very important. 5 important, important leaders you can see. And one thing which they ask is one, how it was started. So the NAM how started. So Bandung Conference. Okay, so Bandung Conference happened in 1955. Okay, so this date is important. And then the Belgrade. Belgrade was the first summit. Right. So Belgrade was the first summit that happened in 1969. Okay. So Belgrade that happened in 1969. These 2 dates are important in seeing from the NAM perspective. And then we have important leaders. Right. But before going to discuss about the leaders, let's just see what is NAM. Right. Let's just have the clarity. So one thing I will just read here. Non-aligned movement is not isolationism. I also, nor neutrality. It means that it doesn't mean that I don't care about what is happening in US or USSR alliances or that region. It is about mediating between the two. So it's a very active involvement. It's not it's not a neutral thing. It's an active involvement. So you can see how it was a very big step at that point that Nehru took that point, right, with the help of all 4 other country members, right? So it was, what was it, and you have to be very clear about it, that it is not isolationism, it is not neutrality, it is a active involvement of mediating between the two, right? And then coming to the leaders. Okay, so these leaders are very important. At least remember the country name and the leader's name, right? If you can't remember everything about them, at least try to remember the name of those people, right? And then also the countries, right? So the first country is Yugoslavia. Tito was there, Joseph Broz Tito, and then Jawaharlal Nehru, India, and then we have Egypt. Nasser was there. Sukarno, Indonesia, and then we have Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. Okay, so this important figures are very important, and because this chapter is all about a Cold War and non-aligned movement, so remembering this is very important, right? And then for getting a better understanding, you can also see their work, right? So what they have done. So you can see here in the chart that how the Tito has fought against the Germany in the World War II, right? And the communism, he was a communist, maintained a distance between the Soviet Union, right? So that you can see about the Jawaharlal Nehru, you can see the efforts of the Afro-Asian unity, right? And then you can see the faith in UNO, disarmament policy, peaceful coexistence, right? And then the Egypt, you can see his contribution in anti-imperialism, Arab nationalism, right? And important thing is here is this Suez Canal, right? So these are some important thing about those leaders, but this you can remember or you cannot remember. It's on you. If you have the capacity, you can do, but at least remember the country name and the leader's name, right? And then you can see how he was involved in the freedom struggle against the imperialism and organized the Bandung Conference that was overthrown by the military coup, right? And then you can see how he opposed the neo-colonialism. So these are their works, what they have done in their lives, right? So these are some important works. It just so that you can relate, and also if there is a possibility that they can ask MCQs, so at least read 2 or 3 times, right? But try to remember the names. So here we have discussed the important first summit that happened in Belgrade. Okay, 1961, that happened in Belgrade. So some things are very important, like how many people have attended, right? How many members were there, right? And then what was the 3 important factors. So the 3 important factors was, first one is the cooperation between those 5 countries. Okay, and then there was a Cold War tension that was happening at that point, right? And then also there was the entry, there was the USA, USSR, and then they got involved in the World War II. So the countries like France and UK and those countries were somehow freed their colony, right? So the newly independent countries were emerging. So that became the third reason, where many decolonized African or Asian countries that emerged, right? And there was 16 by the 1916, you can see, if there is something written like this, 16 members in African members, they have entered the UN, there is a possibility that they can ask in MCQs, right? So try to read that again, so that at least you can attempt that. If you can't learn that, try to attempt that, and that you can do by reading again and again, right? And then how at this point you can see that NAM is still in existence and it is expanding, right? And then coming to the economic structure. So when NAM was formed, it was because of that political structure, that Cold War rivalry that happened, that was at that point, right? But they also tried to have their economic structure so that they can have their trade also, right? To have that financial trade and economic structure, they have also resorted to have that structure that called the NEO, right? So that called the NEO, New International Economic Order, right? And it was because if you see many newly independent countries, they were the colony of some countries, right? So they by economic point of view, you can see that those countries were very poor, right? So that's why they came to develop that, and that the foundation was made at the UN CTAD, right? So and then you can, so that foundation was led in UN CTAD. What was that? United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Okay, and then they brought out the report. On the basis of that report, they have formed the NEO, and that report was came in 1972, and then you can see the title. These are very important because they probably can ask you in MCQs, right? And then what was the report? So that report proposed what they have proposed. So these are some, mentioned that this LDC means the least developed countries, okay, should control their resources exploited by the developed countries. Okay, so so this there should be a trading system so that they can control their trade by themselves, right? And then they could sell their products, okay, and they get benefit from them, that also, right? And then to reduce the cost of technology from the Western world, and then you can see how the non-aligned movement become the base for establishment of this kind of initiative, and NIEO, right? So by the 1970s, that by what happened in 1980s, however, that it started getting faded away, and somehow started it become very less important, but it was a very good step, so that they can control their trade, they can have their own trading system. And so you can just say that NIEO is a trading system of newly independent countries, so that they can control their economic trade structure, and they can come out of that poverty that they have faced due to that colonial structure, right? And some dates are important, right? So dates are important, these titles are important. So these are some these are important from the MCQ point of view. If you are reading it from your NCERT book, try to read it again and again, and try to focus on this particular aspects, right? So that you can remember it. And coming to the India and Cold War, so we already know that how our prime minister at that point, he was also the foreign minister at that point, and he has played a very important role, that he has initiated a policy that was about mediating between the two countries, right? So from that point of view, India has played a very important role. And so you can just say that the Indian policy was not about fleeing away, right? It's not about neutrality. It was about actively intervening in the world, right? And then non-aligned movement also gave the voice to the India and the other all other newly independent countries, so that they can speak about what they want to tell or what they want to say during that period when there was a rivalry and only there was two superpower. So that you can see that important decisions in the international orders that we can we had that opportunities. And then but we cannot go off the criticism that have made against the NAM policy, and that somehow they ask unprincipled. Why they are saying? Because at that point the India was saying that the India or the other all the NAM countries, they were saying that it's an isolationist country, neutralism, and it is getting actively involved. But somehow if you see at that point it was not it was not possible to do that, because there was two sole superpower, there was military alliance, the system was very different. So because it was just starting and it was the very bold steps, that's why the critics are those who are opposing some principles. And criticism, if you are at the very bottom level, if you don't understand the criticism is not about just that you are pointing out the negative thing. You are just pointing out negative things so that the other person could make it better, right? So the criticism is about the unprincipled, right? So the first criticism was made by unprincipled. And the important criticism in our case that happened is because we will when we will be discussing the Indian politics, we will discuss how after the after Nehru, Shastri came, and then Indira Gandhi, right? So what happened during the 1960s? There was a kind of famine happened. There was a food security crisis, and also there was some rivalry that was happening. You can say that Mao Nixon pact. So what was that? It was kind of Mao was the general secretary or the leader of, he was the president of China, and Nixon was the president of US, and they made some pact against the India, right? So in order to respond that, or in order to protect ourselves, what we have done is that we have signed a friendship treaty. So we have signed a friendship treaty with USSR in 1971. One reason was this. The other reason was also the kind of economic economic financial conditions we were facing at that time due to famine and all. And also at that point we had a war with Pakistan in a way of liberating Bangladesh. So that all compelled us so that we can get that all compelled us to sign the Treaty of Friendship with the USSR. So that was a major criticism. Here you can see unprincipled. And then the second one is important criticism is that although we were saying that it's active involvement, we are not going to join any one of the alliances, but again we have although not joined from our side, we have just abstained from that. We are not here signing the military alliances. We have signed the friendship agreement, but somehow it signifies that NAM, despite having the member of NAM, we were relied on the USSR. So that was one criticism of the NAM. And then there is a timeline which is which will give you a kind of context so that you can remember the things clearly. So first thing, just for your understanding, let me just go to one by one. So the first thing, we have discussed the Truman Doctrine, 1947. That happened in 1947, right? So what was Truman Doctrine? It was a part of containment policy we have discussed in the first slide. And then the Marshall Plan. So it was a reconstruction program to the Western European countries, right? 47 to 52, right? And then the Berlin Blockade. What is Berlin Blockade? That wall was made, right? The Berlin Wall was made. That when was that happened? 1948 to 49. And then the Korean War we have discussed. That was also one arena of rivalry, that is 50 to 53, right? And then we have here the Vietnam. So here we have the Vietnam, and we have discussed the here we have the you can see the Geneva Accord, right? And then in the important one in 54 is Geneva Accord, and then the American intervention, that Vietnam War, which was going on between the North Vietnam and the South Vietnam. So the US intervened in 1954 to 75, and then we can see the CENTO, okay, Central Treaty Organization, that was signed in 1955, and then we can see the Soviet intervention in Hungary in 1956. So these are the important dates. These are very important. And then we have also discussed the Bay of Pigs, right? Bay of Pigs, the background of Cuban Missile Crisis that happened in 1961, and then in 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis happened, and then the American intervention in Dominion Republics, and then the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia, Middle East, these are countries, you should go and see map again and again, so that you can see which countries are the part of. There was 15 countries, the part of USSR, right? So if it is possible for you, go and try to remember those names, because probably they can ask who are the former USSR countries. But if not, just let's just go by that and just see the map and see which were the 15 countries that was a part of USSR, right? And then 1972, that I was discussing, Mao-Nixon plan, right? Mao-Nixon pact. Out of that response, we have signed the treaty, right? So treaty with the USSR. So Mao-Nixon pact that happened 1972, and then the Vietnamese intervention in Cambodia, and then the detente period that was going on. Okay, we have signed the SALT 1, SALT 2, and then this intervention happened in Afghanistan by the USSR, and then those arm control again that get paused for some time, and then that happened again after the disintegration, or during that period of disintegration in 1990s, right? The START 1 and START 2, right? So that this one is important, the Afghanistan intervention by the USSR. And then we can see Gorbachev. In the next chapter, we will discuss about the Gorbachev. He was the General Secretary of USSR, and he has started reforms process, and he was one of the reason for the disintegration of USSR. So that we will discuss in next chapter, and then we will discuss how during that period when the USSR become very weaker. So that point, the Berlin Wall was fall down. That was made in 1948. So that formed down, unification of Germany happened, and the disintegration of USSR happened. And this disintegration of USSR we are going to discuss in next chapter. Thank you.